Well, good afternoon from Moscow. I'm Steve Rosenberg, one of the BBC's Moscow correspondents. I try to keep up with the Russian papers, what the Russian papers are saying. And most days I try to do a little video review of the Russian papers and post it on my BBC Twitter account. Today I'm going to do a live review of the papers to give you a flavour of what the Russian papers today are saying about Michael Flynn and his resignation. It's quite interesting. First of all, let's look at what the pro-Kremlin papers are saying. And we'll start with this one. This is the Российская Газета. This is the Russian government paper. And its headline today is "The First Loss in Trump's Team." It declares that opponents of the US president are using Flynn's resignation for a new wave of hysteria against Russia. And you hear that phrase a lot, hysteria against Russia, or anti-Russian hysteria, or Russophobia. You hear that a lot in the Russian state media here to talk about what's happening in America. If we look under the photograph, it says that having failed to bring down Trump, his opponents have come down like a ton of bricks on Flynn, forcing him to resign. Again, portraying Michael Flynn as a victim. And the paper goes on to say that the sudden and scandalous resignation of a key advisor casts a shadow over the president himself and without doubt, the paper says, will be used by his opponents to ratchet up anti-Russian hysteria for an internal political battle. Once again, this idea of hysteria, and also mentions witch hunts. Let's move on to another pro-government, pro-Kremlin paper. This is Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is one of the most popular tabloids in the country. Again, it portrays Michael Flynn as a victim. It says here that, according to one of the versions of events, the contents of Michael Flynn's conversation with the Russian ambassador was leaked by US intelligence. They are not shy, the paper says, of listening in to the telephone conversations of White House staff and Russian diplomats in the USA. And it quotes a political pundit as saying that this is a big blow to Russian-American relations, but the pundit says that it will be Trump and Putin who will review sanctions and no one else. And one other pro-Kremlin paper, this is Izvestia, the same kind of phrases, the same kind of ideas, very supportive of Michael Flynn. It says Flynn was a supporter of détente with Moscow and a return to the active process of negotiations between two major powers instead of the ultimatums that the former American administration spoke to Russia with. He saw the possibility for fruitful cooperation with Russia in the battle against Islamic terrorist groups, Izvestia says, in the Middle East. And then, some very powerful phrases from Izvestia, it says that pressure will increase on Donald Trump and there will be attempts to sabotage the activity of the activities of the US administration by the US intelligence services, and there will be increasing amounts of groundless accusations against the new president and his closest aides. And again, this is a recurring theme you get in the pro-Kremlin press and in state-controlled television as well, that there's very little criticism at all, almost no criticism of Donald Trump, and a lot of criticism of the US intelligence services, of the American press, and of Donald Trump's critics in the Republican Party. Let us move on to one other paper, some messages coming in. If you do have any questions, by the way, while we're doing this, please send them in. This is an interesting paper. This is Moskovsky Komsomolets. Again, a popular tabloid. It often has articles which are supportive of the Kremlin, but also critical of the Kremlin. And on its front page, it has an article called "Donald Trump's Right Hand Has Been Cut Off." The writer says that a clear, unambiguous signal has been given after the resignation of Michael Flynn to all former and present and future American officials. And that signal is, he says, that attempts to improve relations with Russia will be fatal for your career. And he continues inside, it's quite interesting. He says that the resignation of a major foreign policy official for doing his job, talking to the Russian ambassador, is in the spirit of Stalin, he says. He goes on to say that if Flynn, before taking office, had been holding negotiations with the British or the Japanese or even the Chinese ambassador, this probably wouldn't have led to a scandal, he writes. Those people who couldn't wait to trip up Trump's advisor would have had to wait for another opportunity. And he goes on to say that in the era of Bill Clinton, the fuse for almost every major Washington scandal was sex. Now, the fuse for scandal is the phrase links with Russia. So again, very supportive of Michael Flynn, very critical of what's been happening in the United States. But not all Russian papers take this line. If we move away from the pro-Kremlin press, for example, to Vedomosti, it's a business daily, but also does politics too. It basically says that Michael Flynn is to blame for his own downfall. It says that he lied. It says that it was his lie about the contents of his conversation with the Russian ambassador in Washington which brought him down. And if we go in and continue that article, it's quite interesting. It says that Flynn's resignation could lower Moscow's hopes for the removal of sanctions. And it quotes political pundit Vladimir Frolov as saying that Flynn was the main channel of influence of the Kremlin on Donald Trump. Back in the days of the election campaign, he was one of the most decisive in wanting a big deal with Russia, a military alliance in the battle against ISIS, in exchange for removing some of the sanctions, he says. He was the one pushing this option in Washington that Moscow wanted. And then he concludes by saying now this big deal is in question because Vice President Pence, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and the Defence Minister James Mattis are cooler on the idea of a big deal. So that gives you a taste, I think, of the different views being expressed in the Russian press. Once again, the pro-Kremlin newspapers, no criticism of Donald Trump, blaming those around Trump, blaming the media, blaming the intelligence services, blaming everyone except for Donald Trump. But some of the newspapers which are less supportive of the government here, taking a different approach. Now, let me have a look at some of the questions coming in. Joyce Morin says, I can read the articles. Tell me something I can't find here. Russian tabloids are not much different from any British or American tabloids. Bannon is Leninist by his own admission. That is where a lot of responsibility lies. I've heard that expressed by other people too. Lisa Sims asks, did the Russians ever mention Steve Bannon and feelings about him? There have been articles about Steve Bannon, but I have to say that most of the coverage is centred around Donald Trump, and he's been dominating, really, the Russian papers for the last few months. There was an article a couple of weeks ago which suggested that actually 1 month Donald Trump got more mentions than Vladimir Putin, which is saying something because there is pretty much blanket coverage of Vladimir Putin, certainly in the pro-Kremlin newspapers. Lorelei Randa comments, doesn't it speak volumes that the administration is more concerned about the leaks that got Flynn caught than the substance of the calls? Yeah, absolutely. There is that opinion. Datsish Shlanka, I bet he doesn't even know what's written there, and it's so easy to brainwash those who can't read Russian. Can you demonstrate your Russian? Datsy, you don't believe I can speak Russian? I can. Я говорю по-русски. Я понимаю, что там написано. Я надеюсь, что вы поверите, что я понимаю, что там написано. I do speak Russian, so I can understand what's written there. Ruwaida asks, are these claims of Russian-US links making President Putin appear stronger? It's an interesting question. My take on this is that actually whatever happens, however this ends, Russia comes out on top here. Because if Donald Trump gets on with Vladimir Putin when they eventually meet, that could lead to an easing of sanctions on Russia, and Russia wins there. If, however, the two leaders don't get on when they meet, then Russia can fall back on its old method of doing things. In other words, of demonizing America, of turning America into a scapegoat for Russia's problems at home. And that's quite useful for Russia when you consider that there are presidential elections coming up in a year's time. Plus, all the chaos, all the drama going on in America right now, that is also quite useful for the government here, because it can show that on state TV and it can compare that to what it will call stability in Russia. Again, that's quite useful with elections 12 months away. So however this plays out, I think, there's a feeling here that Russia will emerge on top. Of course, the Kremlin continues to deny that it's tried to influence the US election. You won't find a Russian official who will go on a record saying that they did hack the Democratic Party servers, or they did try to get Donald Trump elected. One interesting thing I noticed in the run-up to the US election, all the pro-Kremlin papers were very supportive of Donald Trump. It was clear that the state-controlled media backed Donald Trump. There was lots of criticism of Hillary Clinton. And then 1 week before voting, the tone changed. And it was as if the state media here had decided that actually Hillary Clinton was going to win this election. And the tone changed, and suddenly there were lots of articles criticising the election, claiming there was going to be lots of voting fraud, undermining the democratic electoral process. And after Donald Trump won, all of that disappeared. And once again, the papers returned to praising Donald Trump, portraying him as an anti-establishment, anti-elitist, almost like a Robin Hood type figure, who was going to break through the corrupt Washington establishment. It's fascinating when you think that Donald Trump is basically a billionaire, an oligarch, and there's no way, I think, that here in Russia an oligarch would be allowed to run for president. Let's have a look at some more of your messages. Maria Popova says, your Russian is good. Thank you, Maria. Someone believes me now that I can speak Russian. Philip Horsey, lovely Russian accent, well served up on those doubters. Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Clive Smith asks, so you speak Russian and read it. How's your vodka drinking skills? I have to say, Clive, not very good. One drop and I'm under the table, and I certainly don't want to demonstrate on a Facebook Live. One other interesting thing about this paper. I mentioned that Komsomolskaya Pravda is one of the most popular tabloids. You know how in Britain the Sun newspaper always has a page 3 girl, a lady on page 3? Well, for some reason, Komsomolskaya Pravda always has Vladimir Putin on page 2. Whatever copy of Komsomolskaya Pravda you pick up, and I've noticed this day in, day out. Here's another one. Page 2, Vladimir Putin. You can always trust, whatever's happening in the world, there could be chaos around the world, but always on page 2 of Komsomolskaya Pravda, you'll find Vladimir Putin. So, a mark of stability there, perhaps. Well, I hope that's given you some flavour, at least, of the Russian press. I'm going to continue following them here, because I think it's quite interesting to see how the line changes or doesn't change, particularly with the pro-Kremlin papers, because if there's a change in tone there regarding Donald Trump, that could signal a change in attitude, I think, of the Kremlin to America's president. I hope that's been quite interesting. Keep watching, and best wishes from Moscow.